We are back for another video to help you learn. It's difficult to believe that our pause from coming together in a class has been extended for another week, and who knows how long this is all gonna take. I think it is stressful for everybody, so I know it's stressful for you because probably you have a noisy brother, or your sister is playing the radio really loud and it's difficult to listen to what Mr. Christopher has to say. But it's important that we work hard on these subjects, and I expect you to be able to hand in the homework on a regular basis. Okay, so this is Monday, so this is video day, and I expect you to be able to answer the questions on the handout that I sent you yesterday. Sunday, I sent you the handout for this video, and it's all about production and cost, and we're going to be discussing that in a few minutes. But first we are going to answer a few questions that some of you have been asking me, and I want to use this opportunity to be able to answer these questions. You can, in fact, contact me either through email at leo.s@buv.edu.vn, or you can send me a notice through Skype that you're going to communicate with me by Skype. My password at Skype is small c Christopher.Scoggins, CHRISTOPHER .SCOGGINS, and that is my password, and that will get you in to the Skype, and I will accept you, of course. And you can, don't need to worry or get all stressed up about it. Sit on your sofa and have a cup of tea or whatever, and you can talk to me and ask me questions. Some of you have told me that you don't quite understand everything that we're dealing with. Some of you tell me that you are listening to the videos and you are answering the questions on the handout, but that sometimes you still don't understand. I'm really keen to help you. That's why I'm here. I'm sure every teacher at Chuvenan loves their students as much as I love you, and for that reason they will be just as prepared and happy to work hard to make sure that you succeed on the final exams. So let's start with question number one. Why is utility so important? Well, that's a really good question. That came from last week, where we were discussing marginal utility and utility. And it is one of those theoretical concepts that is, and sometimes I would say has been created to make an argument more logical. Clearly, economists need to understand the behavior of consumers. If they are prepared to come up with these laws, whether it's the law of demand or it's the law of economies of scale or something like that, they have to assume that they understand people and how they're going to act. And of course, it never quite works out that way, because consumers are very irrational. Okay, irrational meaning not rational, and that means that they don't follow conventional economic theory, like as the prices go down, consumption goes up. Well, sometimes they don't go up because maybe you think that the price is too cheap, and we call that the Veblen good or the snob value effect. And this actually is the real world, okay? And we live in the real world. So because of this, because the economists are looking for ways not only to measure, price changes or how companies either increase or decrease their level of production, but they also want to know what is their, level of satisfaction. And that's what utility is all about. Okay, that utility is a measurement of satisfaction. Of course, the obvious question is, is it a valid concept? And my answer is, I am not sure. I don't know if it is. I know that for the last 50 years, certainly since the 1930s, concepts of utility have been a basic and integral part of economics, and it's also part of the Cambridge syllabus, and therefore you need to study it because it is required material. So to answer your question, the reason why it is so important is because it would imply a certain logic of behavior that, you know, if you're going to do something, you want to know almost within certainty that the consumers will react in a certain way. And they will react in a certain way if they have some form of measurement about how satisfied the consumers are. Now, of course, the obvious one is like, you know, what is the measurement? Is it 1 to 10? Is it A, B, C, D, E? You know, isn't it true that some consumers will feel differently than others? Maybe some consumers will feel irritated that you're asking them. They'll say, this is a private matter. I don't share such information. Some people are too busy to answer the questions, and so they'll tell you anything just to get you away so that they can go on their merry way. The bottom line is that we want to believe that we have enough information for companies to make important investment decisions. And it's a very good question, to be honest, you know, like, is it really that important, you know? But it is, because, you know, it is part of the syllabus. It is used in the economic world. The Minister of Finance will use it all the time. And so we have no choice but to sort of kind of analyze it, particularly in terms of marginal utility. In other words, the extra satisfaction that you gain from one more unit of consumption. That would basically be, and that's really what, you know, a lot of business people are interested in. You know, how much extra are consumers interested in consuming more, you know, when they do something, when they make a production decision. The next question is it really possible to measure utility with any accuracy? That's a really, really good question. It's measured by something called an util, U-T-I-L. And they somehow believe that you can measure it by the amount of money that you're willing to give up for, you know, that extra glass of water. If you remember last week, we were talking about walking across the Sahara Desert, and you know, they were saying that, okay, how much, would you be happier if you had another glass of water? You know, and the first glass was really yummy, and the second glass was even yummier, but eventually your satisfaction gained from one more unit of consumption, in other words, another glass of water, would eventually begin to decline until you actually came to a situation where you were almost ill from drinking so much water, and that you would actually pay somebody not to receive any more water. Okay, so what it means is that, you know, the util is the amount of money that you are prepared to pay for that extra consumption of that product. Okay, and obviously, you know, if you're paying someone not to drink the water, that would mean that would be a negative form of utility. So you'd have, let's say, -5. In other words, rather than paying for the water, you're actually paying them not to give you the water. The third question comes down to the cost-benefit analysis, which was, I think, 2 weeks ago. And the cost-benefit analysis seems obvious when making an important investment decision. Why do you say that political considerations are usually more important? Well, that's a really good question, and I suppose it's a question based on the dynamics of the theoretical world and the real world. Because in the theoretical world, you know, you can have, you know, a big flip chart you know, and you could say all the advantages and the disadvantages of, let's say, I don't know, making a new extension on a school, for example. So, you know, should we or should we not build a gymnasium for Chu-Van-An, for example, you know, or a new cafeteria or something like that. And so you're going to say, well, you got a lot of costs and there's a lot of money over here. And then you sort of say, okay, well, you have to sort of calculate the benefits as well. And you're going to say, well, that means that the students are able to eat, you know, good food in the school, and we need another building, and that there's enough space and there's no problem, et cetera, et cetera. And then you've got to divide it between not just the private individual, but also society in general. So it's like the private benefit versus the social benefit. And you've got to say to yourself, okay, well, you know, is this something that, you know, we can really quantify, and is it really, really accurate? Well, the answer to your question is that the cost-benefit analysis is often very subjective. In other words, it depends on who's writing the report, particularly when it comes to the public benefit and the public cost. Because, I mean, particularly the public benefit, because it's a lot more difficult to quantify. In other words, you know, you could say, well, the satisfaction that comes from students eating good food in the school, and this will translate into better results for the student and will make for a better educated, you know, Vietnamese student, and it will mean that students will succeed more at university or going on to jobs, etc., etc. Well, will it really? You know, is that guaranteed? Well, of course it's not guaranteed. And therefore, somehow it's a lot easier and less subjective if you just say to yourself, well, you know, if we do this, people are going to love the government even more, okay? And certainly in Canada, you have it all the time. And people making decisions about, you know, whether they should expand, let's say, an airport, or should they, you know, build a subway system. I mean, they're in the process of building a subway system in both Ho Chi Minh City and in Hanoi, and there's also supposed to be a bullet train between Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City. And so somebody, I'm almost guaranteeing it, I'd bet $100 on it, that somebody sat down and wrote up a cost-benefit analysis about doing a bullet train from Hanoi to Ho Chi Minh City. And then they come to a conclusion after sort of weighing the benefits and the disadvantages and the public benefits and the private benefits, etc., etc. And they say, well, this is our result. Well, okay, now you've got a result, and you sort of say, in my opinion, I think we should go ahead with it. Well, okay, then that sounds like a good idea, and that you balance the argument, but now, is it politically doable? In other words, you know, will the government have problems if in fact they go ahead with this decision? And, you know, probably the government in Vietnam, you know, being the Communist Party of Vietnam, they are going to consider the fact that building a public transportation system in Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City will actually benefit, you know, the working class and people who are lower income, people who don't have a car or a motorcycle, who are concerned about the environment, etc., etc., because this is the way politically they see the world. They see the world in terms of, you know, helping lower income people as much as possible. They would say, well, in our opinion, this is a really good idea, promoting, you know, public transportation, because this is what we believe in, you know. And I don't see this as necessarily a bad idea, you know. I think, obviously, I think all of you would agree that we all need a public transportation system. But I promise you that in other countries, it doesn't happen that way. Like in the United States, there's lots of big cities that have been desperate, you know, have been desperate for public transportation, but let's say the conservative government or the Republican government in power felt that, okay, well, this is going to hurt the private sector, okay, because the private sector is selling cars, selling more petrol, building more roads through private contracts and that sort of thing. There's a lot of money to be made in keeping people away from public transportation. And so now they're only now starting to build, even in a place like California, they're only now starting to build, you know, like a few fast trains. And I don't think they have a single bullet train in the United States, because it was never viewed as a priority. So this really shows how, politically speaking, the final decision, in other words, somebody actually signing the check to pay for a project, will often become a very political act. I think that let's say the importation of Mercedes Benzes, okay, using hard currency from Germany, I don't think that the Vietnamese government see importing Mercedes Benzes into Vietnam is a very high priority. I think that they would consider such activities as being wasteful to the public good, and that most people don't own Mercedes Benzes, and therefore why should they use hard currency to pay for a lot of these expensive luxury vehicles, when really the support of the government comes from the average and low income person in the country, and who are not at all interested or don't have access to luxury cars. So, when an American politician might say, yeah, we need to sort of import more luxury cars because all my buddies and colleagues, they need to drive around in luxury. I don't think that the Vietnamese government are going to think about that. They're going to be saying, well, actually, our political constituency, in other words, the people who come to our support and who we are working with, are the average Vietnamese people, and they are not people who need the importation of luxury vehicles. So to answer your question, I think that, it's a factor, okay? It's a fact. It's not the only issue. I want to believe that every government considers the technical issue of the cost-benefit analysis. There are numbers and money that you can pass through that you can actually quantify the benefits sometimes. Obviously, you can quantify the costs, but benefits are more difficult to calculate. But usually it would be true to say that a cost-benefit analysis would be useful. But what I'm saying, if I have to be really honest, okay, in this day and age where everybody is somehow supporting their own political constituency around the world, I think that a lot of these big decisions, like do we build an airport, do we build a bullet train, do we produce public transportation so that everybody can have cheap transportation around the city, I think it is pretty political. Okay, and that's just my way of thinking. Now, you don't have to agree with me, okay, and Cambridge don't actually need to believe in you or agree with you either. But what you need to do is you need to be able to probably come up with sort of like a counterfoil, we call this in English, where you have maybe sets of choices. Should we do more of this or more of that? And probably a well-written answer on the exam would be to suggest that, a cost-benefit analysis is an important part of the decision, but not the only part that needs to be considered. Okay, so let's go on to the handout. And the handout is all about production and costs. Okay, you should have your book open to chapter 7, okay, called The Price System and Microeconomy. And last week we went through utility and marginal utility, and this time we're dealing with production and costs. We go through, there's a lot of vocabulary in this, and I don't normally do this on the handouts, but this time I decided that the vocabulary was really important for you to understand what we're talking about. So let's go through each one. That the long run, when we say the long run, the period of time when all factor inputs can be varied, but the state of technology remains the same. Okay. Generally speaking, I would say that it's about 2 years. Okay. It depends on the actual product. Like technology is incredibly quick. That you will find that a computer becomes no longer relevant. It's no longer cutting edge, you might say, after about 2-3 months. I remember when the first laptop came out with a terabyte of hard drive, and I thought, oh man, this is unbelievable, a terabyte of hard drive space. I've got to rush out and buy a new laptop with a terabyte of hard drive space. Whoa, now, hard drives are as cheap as chips, as we say in English. And, you can get a 5 terabyte one. In fact, the Mac Pro came out, and I think that they had something like the possibility of having about 15 terabytes of SSD, space. I thought, whoa, this is unbelievable, And, before you know it, probably that's nothing special as well. So they're going to go on and on and on and on. But usually, if you're building chairs and tables or something a bit more ordinary than, new laptops, you're going to find that the long run is something which is in a period certainly more than the production cycle. Okay, in other words, more than the whole process of producing something. Short run is the period of time when at least one factor input to the production process cannot be varied, okay, cannot be changed. And this is inevitable. It's also relevant to say that a short term is sometimes within the actual production process, so things can be changed. Let's say, certainly if you're making, let's say, dresses, and suddenly green is out. You've been watching the Paris fashion shows, and suddenly green as the color is out and blue is in. Okay, so suddenly in the short term, you've got to very, very quickly change your strategy and move on to the blues, and that would be definitely a short run. You'd have to in the middle of the production cycle. In other words, when you're in the process of making these green sweaters or whatever, green dresses, you've decided that now green is out and blue is in. And then you've got the very long run, and that's the period of time when the state of technology may change. Okay, so that could mean even as much as 6 years, where you're going to have to change the technology involved in the production. The best example of that I can think of is the newspaper industry. Now, this is way before your time, but I remember when I was a kid that newspapers used to be made by these big printers that you would actually put these letters on a sort of a special rack, these metal letters, and it was very antiquated and very ancient, and it seemed to be a bit medieval, you might say. And then suddenly everything was computerized, and a lot of journalists, a lot of newspaper people lost their jobs, and they were very angry, and they went out on strike, and they said, no, you cannot change the newspaper industry. These are people who are kind of going against the reality of life, okay? That we no longer live in a world where it's going to take you maybe 24 hours to set up a newspaper edition. People want news immediately, and that means that things are going to have to change. When I was your age, information on the stock market, for example, was provided by people who actually owned a chair. This sounds incredible, but they actually owned a chair at the New York Stock Exchange, and you would pay about $1 million to own a chair, to sit there and write down all the notes of the changing prices of all the stocks. Well, you are living in a different world today. For an app that costs about $2.99, you can download an app that will put over your screen the blipping machine there, which basically provides you with information about different stocks and how their prices are changing, going up or going down. And this is something that is obviously essential today in the modern world of investment and selling and buying, etc., etc. And we know that particularly in this past week where the stock market has been crashing because of the coronavirus, that people are making decisions, the average person is making decisions about, should I buy or should I sell a particular stock? Now, because of the coronavirus, obviously anybody who owns an airline stock must be crazy to hold on to it. So you're going to say, just sell at any price. So what you've got is you've got millions of sellers and almost nobody buying. And so what does that mean? It just means that the price is going to suddenly crash. And suddenly a big airline, maybe like British Airways, which used to be a very valuable asset, is now almost worthless because nobody wants to own an airline during a crisis that we are living through today. Okay, so these are good examples of technology changing so dramatically that the whole production process has changed. So now, I'll be really honest with you, stockbrokers are almost unheard of today. The idea of going to somebody's office, a bit like a dentist or a doctor, and you go to the office and you say, I've got $1,000 that I received from my grandmother for my birthday present, and I would like to invest this money in some buying a company share or buying bonds or something like that. And the guy or the woman will sit there, and say, well, according to my judgment, I think you should be buying Microsoft shares, because those are the most profitable. Well, he doesn't do that for free either. And he used to do it for about 8% of the value of your investment. He basically wants in money. A bit like a dentist is not for free, and certainly in Vietnam, most of the doctors are not for free. But a stockbroker would do that. Well, today you can go to CharlesSchwab.com and for, I think it's $1.99, and they're even talking on the news about making it totally free. But for $1.99, you can buy or sell 1 million Microsoft shares if you want to. That it's not going to cost you anything at all. So it means in some ways that you have brought huge freedom and democracy for the technology has done this, has brought huge freedom and democracy to investors around the world. Now the problem, of course, with this, the downside, is now you have every John and Mary, every person in the street who thinks of themselves as an expert on investment is now investing, maybe because you really like the product, okay? Let's say, I don't know, you really like, a company that makes shoes, like your favorite shoes. Let's say Bata, okay? Bata is a Canadian company. You may not know that. There's a Bata in the Aeon Mall, and there's a number of Bata shops in this area. So Bata is actually a Canadian store. Now let's just say that I actually, being a Canadian myself, I'm going to say, well, I think that Bata is a good company, and I like their shoes, and I'm wearing a Bata shoe right now. I'm going to invest in the Bata shoe company. That is the worst, the absolute worst reason to invest in the Bata shoe company. You don't know what their plans are for the future. You don't know if they're investing. You don't know if they're making any money or not. You haven't done your homework, which is exactly what a a stockbroker would do for his money. He would basically do some homework to find out what investments are likely to go up and which ones are likely to go down. So what it means now is that the stock market is much less predictable, because now you've got millions of decision makers who haven't necessarily done their homework, and they don't really know what's actually going on. So for that reason, this would be a really good example of a situation where people cannot just assume that you're always doing the right thing by moving to technology. There's an argument on that, but this is the reality of life. Whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, technology has changed, and we have to accept it. Okay, so that's what the really long term is all about. Okay, then we got the total product, okay, which is the quantity of the output measured in physical units produced by a given number of inputs over a period of time. Okay, so the total product might be, I don't know, 100 cars that have been produced in a factory over a period of 24 hours. Okay, the average product, okay, which would be the quantity of output per unit of factor input. It is the total product divided by the level of output. Okay, so it means really that you're going to have to sort of divide the number of cars over the amount of money that you have spent to make those cars. So it's almost like the outputs divided by the inputs. The marginal product, in addition to the output produced by an extra unit of input. Okay, so the word marginal means an extra unit of something. Okay, so a marginal product would be the extra output produced by one more unit of input. Okay, so let's say you've got something, I don't know, you've got a table, and you're going to have one more unit of input, maybe labor. Do you actually make the product any better? I mean, that's an interesting question, because it brings into the whole debate about how many cooks will ruin the soup, as we say in English. Like one cook will make a good soup, and two cooks will make a really better soup, and three cooks maybe even better. But eventually you're going to have so many cooks that maybe the cooks will start fighting over the soup, and the quality of the soup will go down. And then we have the returns to scale. And this is probably the most important issue in this section on production and cost, is the returns to scale, because this is something like economies of scale is something that we have talked about in class many times, that the economies of scale, as you know, what it looks like, you should know what it looks like. It's like a U-shaped average cost curve there, and you've got the economies of scale down one side and the diseconomies on the other side. And we were saying that the economies of scale suggests that as the level of production increases, the costs per unit actually goes down. And this is one of the reasons why, when you buy 100 rolls of toilet paper, and this is a relevant point because people are fighting over toilet paper, you should go to YouTube, by the way, and just type in the word, coronavirus toilet paper, and you're going to see these American supermarket customers actually fighting over the last roll of toilet paper. So in some ways it's very funny, really, to think that people are actually going to blows over who gets the last who gets the last roll of toilet paper. I mean, maybe it implies a certain insecurity that we all have, that if the world comes to an end, do we have enough toilet paper to survive until we die? The worst thing you could do is to sort of live without that final roll of toilet paper. I don't know. I just find it amusing to watch it. So this is a good example of economies of scale, is that, you know, when you go out and you buy toilet paper and you buy 30 rolls rather than 2 rolls, you'll always find that the cost per unit actually goes down. And we've talked about this before. We've talked about economies of scale. And I said to you, why is it that economies of scale actually exists? I mean, we know what the logic is, and we can memorize the definition, but the question is, why does it exist? And the answer is clear, okay? That it's the amount that the factory needs, or the factory needs to share out the costs of production, okay, over many units of output, okay? So in other words, if you're producing one car, okay, in a capitalist economy where the government is not bailing out a company, that you have to survive on your own profits, that if you only make one car per day and the costs of running that factory is, let's say, $1 million a day, and that could easily take place. You know, factories are incredibly expensive, all the labor and the machinery and the electricity and et cetera, the taxes, and that you could be paying $1 million a day, okay, to run the factory. And suddenly you've got one car that will pay for that $1 million. So that would be an unbelievably expensive car. So if you share that out by a second car, you can divide that million by half. So now the car costs $500,000, which is still too much. So you make 3 cars or 4 cars or 5 cars. And clearly the cost per unit of paying for running all the fixed costs actually decreases and makes it much more reasonable and much more cost effective. And it's one of the reasons why most companies want to increase their level of production, not decrease their level of production. So Toyota, for example, worldwide probably produces 1 million cars per day. Okay, and by doing so, they have these factories that are so huge that easily the shared support, you know, the shared, you know, price, or the shared money that each car has to pay for the running of the factory becomes smaller and smaller and smaller as you increase the level of production. So if you read the section here on the second page, it says that given that there are fixed factors of production, in the short run, this means that a firm must pay fixed costs even if output is 0. Okay, so this is very relevant for Vietnam. Okay, we have a situation now where we've got factories or whatever that have to close because of the coronavirus, like shops or restaurants or bars or massage parlors or karaoke bars or anything like that. They're all closed now in Hanoi, and whether the owner likes it or not, the landlord of the property, they want their rent, whether you run the business or you don't run the business. And for that reason, you know, you're in a bit of trouble, okay? You have to find that money somehow. So this is why in the short run, this means that a firm must pay the fixed cost even if the output is 0. In other words, the output for a massage parlor would be 0 customers. Okay, for example, if you have rented a building, then for the period of the rental contract, you will need to pay this rent whether or not you actually produce anything at all. So whether you have a customer or not, you still have to pay the rent. You know, Chu Van An has to pay the rent if they do have to pay rent. Whether there are any students or not, they have to pay. The owner of the building does not care whether you produce or not, but just that you pay the rent. This means that a firm will lose an amount equal to the fixed cost even if it does not sell anything. The decision of whether it is financially viable to produce will therefore depend on the variable costs, the costs that exist when producing, because the fixed costs must be paid anyway. Okay, so the variable cost would be the extra cost that would take place because you are producing something, let's say electricity. Okay, if you are making cars, then you're probably using a lot of electricity for all the machines to be working, etc., etc. Therefore, as you increase production, those variable costs will actually go up as well. The decision of whether it is financially viable to produce will therefore depend on the variable costs. Okay, the fixed costs are already spent and should not affect a decision about whether to continue to produce in the short run. If the revenue earned from making and selling the units can at least cover the variable costs, then this means that it is financially worth producing them. Okay. Imagine that the fixed costs are $100. If the firm does not produce, then it makes a loss of $100. If it does produce and earns $20, its losses are only $80. So in other words, losing $80 is better than losing $100. Okay, so in some ways it would suggest that it's a good idea to actually produce rather than not produce. Okay, the firm should therefore continue in production even though it makes a loss because the revenue at least covers the variable costs. When the revenue only equals the variable cost, the loss will be the same whether producing or not producing. This is known as the shutdown point. Okay, if the revenue is less than the variable cost, then the firm should not produce. In the long run, a firm will not continue producing if it is making a loss. It is constrained by resources and so is not committed to fixed costs. The firm will produce only if it breaks even. Okay, breaks even really means the point of production where the revenue will meet the costs. Okay, this means that the total revenue must at least cover the costs. So the firm produces where MR is equal to MC to profit maximize. Okay, so we've got three questions here. Three questions. Give a practical example of increasing returns to scale, constant returns to scale, and decreasing returns to scale. Okay, so I've already answered question C. Okay, so the law of diminishing returns or whatever, or economies of scale, kind of suggests that as you increase production, your costs per units go down. So for C, you can kind of use the example of the car factory that will decrease the cost per unit when it increases production. Now I want you to tell me why, and I told you why on this video. So if you want to go back, reverse the video and listen to me one more time about the idea of accepting the weight of the costs of running the factory. So remember I said if the factory costs $1 million per day to run, then you need to produce a lot of cars in order to cover the costs of running that factory. So if you only produce one car, then that will be an unbelievably expensive car. You're going to have the $1 million, which is the fixed costs, okay, things like taxes or buildings or whatever, plus you're going to have to add all the variable costs. In other words, the rubber for the tires or the steel for the side of the car, the bumpers, or the glass for the windows. So in other words, the absolute minimum price that you could give to that car would be $1 million for the fixed cost plus the variable cost, which might be, I don't know, $10,000, the addition of all the inputs to make the car. And that is what you would have to charge the consumer if you are trying to break even. Not even if you're trying to make a profit, you're just trying to break even. You're trying to stay in business. You're trying to have what they call normal profits, okay? And in your answer, you should probably use a normal profit graph. Give that opportunity to use a normal profit graph. If on the other hand, you're not able to, and definitely you're going to find that no one's going to buy a car for $1,010,000. So you're going to go bankrupt really, really quickly unless you can increase production super quick so that you can slide down that U-shaped average cost curve, so that economies of scale graph will show that you can reduce the level of costs and also by increasing the level of production. And when you reduce the level of costs, it means that you can charge a more competitive price and you'll have a lot more customers and you will become a more profitable firm. So that's what I want you to do, okay, is I want you to give me a concrete example of a company which would actually have decreasing returns to scale. So a car factory, I'm already giving you the answer, but I want you to develop that by explaining to me why that is. Then something where it has increasing returns to scale. In other words, that it's going to increase the cost per unit rather than decreasing it. And then the other one would be where it actually remains the same. Okay, 3 pretty easy questions. Okay, I'm giving you a little bit of a holiday because some people complained that last week the questions were too difficult. So I'm giving you a bit of an easy ride this time. I want 3 concrete examples written down, and I want you to send them to me to Google Classroom before Thursday at 12 o'clock. Okay, Thursday at 12 o'clock. I can read them, I can judge them, I can mark them, I can hand in a report to your school telling me who is actually doing their homework and who is not. So that's about it for today, okay? I've enjoyed this little session here. Hope that you have enjoyed the session too, and we will see you probably next week perhaps, and get to work, finish all the homework that you haven't done, and hopefully we will continue to learn, and hopefully this coronavirus will slowly go away. We can all hope. Bye-bye. Stay safe.